Hello everyone. Welcome to the Listen and Sleep channel. The channel shares good, meaningful books that you should listen to before falling asleep. Without further ado, today's video will start with Rules 2 and 3 of the Deep Work book.
Rule 2. Make use of boredom. To better understand how to master the art of deep work, I recommend that you visit the Nesses Yisroel Synagogue in Spring Valley, New York, at 6 a.m. on weekdays. If you go there, you'll likely see at least 20 cars in the parking lot. Inside, you will encounter dozens of congregation members deeply immersed in their texts. Some of them may be reading silently, whispering in the ancient language, while others are engaged in heated discussions. At one end of the room, a rabbi will lead a larger group in discussion. The people gathering in Spring Valley on this early morning are just a small fraction of the hundreds of thousands of Orthodox Jews who wake up at dawn every weekday, as they do each morning, to engage in the central practice of their faith, spending time each day studying the intricate traditions that have been preserved in Rabbinic Judaism. I first heard about this community from Adam Marlin, a member of the Nesses Yisroel congregation and one of the regulars in the morning study group. According to Marlin, he sets a goal for himself every day to decipher one page of the Talmud, though he admits he doesn't always succeed. Marlin typically works with a shavruta, study partner, to push the limits of his understanding. The Talmud is a collection of texts by Jewish sages spanning over 10 centuries. The book is regarded as the repository of Jewish wisdom. What interests me about Marlin is not just his knowledge of ancient texts, but how he works to achieve that knowledge. In an interview, he emphasized the mental intensity of the morning ritual. He explained, "It's a grueling, serious process, primarily deep work, the kind of work you write about. Running a growing business isn't as taxing as this." Not only did he feel the stress, but he also found it difficult to integrate the routine. A rabbi once explained to him, "You can't assume you've done your daily work unless you've pushed yourself to reach your highest intellectual capacity." Unlike many other Orthodox Jews, Marlin came to his faith relatively late. He only began seriously studying the Talmud at the age of 20. This small story is an insightful example of how our goals can shift, as it allows Marlin to make a clear before and after comparison regarding the effects of his mental training. Results that surprised him. Even though Marlin received a top-notch education before beginning his studies, he holds 3 Ivy League degrees. He was still amazed by the intellectual caliber of his fellow students who had attended much smaller yeshivas but were able to engage in intellectual discourse with those around them. Many of them are very successful in their careers, he explained. No great school helped elevate their intellect. It was clearly because they had been studying every day since the 5th grade. Ivy League, a group of 8 prestigious universities in the northeastern United States. After some time, Marlin began to notice positive changes in his ability to think deeply. He said, "Lately, I've had more creative inspiration in business. I believe this is linked to my daily intellectual practice. This sustained focus has built my intellectual muscles over many years. It wasn't the goal when I started, but it's the result." Adam Marlin's experience underscores an important reality about deep work. The ability to focus intensely is a skill that must be trained. This idea may sound obvious, but it represents the initial understanding most people have of such issues. From my own experience, turning undistracted focus into a habit is easy. It's something you know how to do and understand is beneficial for you, but it's often forgotten due to a lack of motivation to act. This mental setup is fascinating because it implies that you can turn often distracted work into sustained focus if you have enough motivation. However, this awareness doesn't address the difficulty of focusing and the time needed to build your intellectual muscles. In other words, the creative insights that Adam Marlin is experiencing in his work are not as much a result of his earlier deep thinking decisions as they are a product of his daily commitment to building this skill each morning. However, this idea has an inevitable consequence. The effort to focus more deeply will face obstacles unless you also prevent your mind from becoming dependent on distraction. Just as athletes must train their bodies outside of their regular workouts, you'll struggle to achieve the deepest levels of focus unless you actively keep yourself from getting bored. We can see evidence for this claim in the research of Clifford Nass, a former professor of communication at Stanford University who was renowned for his studies on behavior in the digital age. Among other findings, Nass's research showed that continually focusing on digital distractions has long-term negative effects on your brain. Here's a summary of Nass's findings from an interview with Ira Flatow on National Public Radio in 2010. So, we have a scale to divide people into two distinct categories: those who are always multitasking and those who rarely do. People who are always multitasking cannot distinguish what is irrelevant to them. They can't manage their work memory. They're chronically distracted. They use a larger portion of their brain for tasks unrelated to the one at hand. And this has a very harmful mental impact. At that point, Flatow asked Nass if people who are chronically distracted recognize this pattern in their brains. The people we spoke with said, "Look, when I really need to focus, I'll shut everything out and concentrate completely." And unfortunately, they've developed thinking habits that make it impossible for them to do what they say. They're not equipped. They can't continue the work. Nass found that once your brain has adapted to distraction on demand, it becomes very difficult to shake off, even when you want to focus. Specifically, if every moment of potential boredom in life, for example, waiting in line for 5 minutes or sitting alone in a restaurant waiting for friends, quickly fills up when you play with your smartphone, your brain may revert to the mentally harmful effects that Nass's research highlights when it's not yet ready for deep work, even if you frequently set aside time to practice focus. Rule number 1 has shown you how to integrate deep work into your schedule, supporting it with habits and rituals designed to help you consistently reach the limits of your current ability to concentrate. Rule number 2 will help you significantly improve those limits. The following strategies are driven by the important idea that to achieve deep work habits at their best, you need to train, and as noted earlier, this training must address two goals: improving your ability to concentrate deeply and overcoming the urge to be distracted. These strategies take many forms, from isolating distractions to mastering a specific mode of reflection, all of which will contribute to the process of moving from continuous distraction to a true tool for deep concentration. Don't rest after being distracted. Rest after focusing. Many people believe that they can switch between the states of distraction and focus whenever necessary, but as I've argued, this assumption is overly optimistic. Once you've become accustomed to distraction, you'll crave it. Drawing from this reality, I propose a strategy to help you reset your mindset so that your brain is prepared to focus on work. Before diving into the details, let's begin by considering a popular suggestion for dealing with unresolved distractions: the Internet Sabbath, sometimes referred to as a digital detox day. Essentially, this ritual requires you to spend regular time, typically 1 day a week, restraining yourself from using the Internet. Similar to the Sabbath in the Hebrew Bible, which includes a quiet and devoted time to worship God and reflect on His blessings, the Internet Sabbath serves as a reminder of what you miss when you're glued to a screen. Sabbath, a day of rest and worship in Judaism and Christianity. It's unclear who first conceived the idea of the Internet Sabbath, but the concept is often attributed to journalist William Powers, who popularized it through his 2010 book Hamlet's Blackberry. In an interview, Powers summarized it as follows: "Do what Thoreau did, take a break from the world of connection. Don't throw it away." Henry David Thoreau, 1817 to 1862, an iconic American writer, Thoreau advocated for retreating from society to achieve inner freedom by rejecting superficial satisfactions. Much of the advice surrounding the issue of distraction follows a common pattern: trying to avoid online chatter regularly. Some people set aside 1 or 2 months each year to do so. Others follow Powers' suggestion of taking 1 day off each week, while some spend 1 or 2 hours a day disconnected. All these forms of advice are helpful, but once we recognize distraction as the result of constant information connection with the brain, it becomes clear that the internet Sabbath may not be the cure for a distracted mind. Just as eating healthfully one day a week won't help you lose weight if the rest of the week you eat a lot, taking a single day off from distraction won't reduce your brain's craving for these stimuli because most of your time is spent engaged with them. I propose an alternative solution to the internet Sabbath. Instead of planning occasional breaks to escape distraction in order to focus, you should plan to rest after focusing, so that you can accept distraction when it arises. More specifically, simplify the assumption that using the internet is inherently about seeking distractions. Of course, you can use the internet in focused, deep ways, but for those who are easily distracted, this can be a challenging task. Similarly, working offline means you will focus more, though of course, you can still be distracted even when you're not online. With such clear categorization, you will have an effective strategy. Schedule internet usage ahead of time and aim to avoid it more than planned. I recommend keeping a notebook next to your computer while working. In this notebook, write down when you are next allowed to use the internet. Until that time, you must not allow yourself to go online, no matter how tempting it is. The idea behind this strategy is to use distracting activities that don't impair the brain's ability to focus. The continuous switching between low stimulation/high value activities and high stimulation/low value activities, with the least amount of boredom or cognitive challenge, will train your mind to never lose this novelty. This constant switching can be understood as weakening the neural circuits responsible for organizing the resources needed for your attention. By separating internet usage, and thus distraction, you will minimize the instances of accepting distraction, thereby training your mind. For example, if you've scheduled your next internet use for 30 minutes from now, but you start to feel bored and distracted, the next 30 minutes of resistance will become a focus practice. Thus, a completely distracted day, according to your schedule, will turn into a mental workout. Though the basic idea behind this strategy is simple, its execution requires subtlety. To succeed, here are 3 key points to consider. Point number 1. This strategy will work even if your job requires heavy internet usage and/or fast responses to emails. If you spend hours a day online or answering emails quickly, that's fine. It simply means your online blocks will be longer than someone whose job doesn't require much internet use. What matters is not the total amount or duration of your internet use, but ensuring the integrity of your offline blocks. For example, imagine that between meetings, you need to check emails every 15 minutes for 2 hours. Let's assume it takes an average of 5 minutes to check emails. You can schedule a 15-minute online block during those 2 hours, with the remaining time designated for offline blocks. In this scenario, you would use around 90 minutes of your 2-hour window offline, actively resisting distractions. This approach will help you train focus without sacrificing too much connectivity. Point number 2. No matter how you schedule your online blocks, you must still maintain time for offline blocks. In principle, this goal is easier to implement, but in the messy reality of a standard workday, it soon becomes more complicated. An unavoidable issue when implementing this strategy is that while you're in your offline block, some information may require you to connect to the internet to proceed with your current work. If your next online block can't start immediately, you might get stuck. In such cases, the temptation will be strong to quickly give in. So be sure to check the necessary information and return to your offline block. You must resist this temptation. The internet is very alluring. You may think you're just checking an important email, but it's hard to stop yourself from glancing at that urgent new message. You can't allow too many exceptions before your mind begins to see the boundary between online and offline blocks as a mere illusion, undermining the strategy's effectiveness. Therefore, it's crucial that you don't immediately abandon your offline block even if you're stuck. If possible, switch to another offline activity in the current block, or you could use the time to relax. If that's not feasible, perhaps you need to quickly finish an offline task, then adjust your schedule so that your next online block starts sooner. However, the key here is not to schedule the next online block right away. Instead, Wait at least 5 minutes from the current moment before you can go online. This brief waiting period is negligible and won't significantly disrupt your progress, but from a behavioral standpoint, separating the desire to go online from the actual satisfaction of doing so is crucial. Point number 3. Scheduling internet usage at home, as well as at work, can help strengthen your focus-building efforts. If you're glued to your phone or laptop in the evenings and on weekends, that off-hours behavior might be undoing much of the effort you've put into reconnecting your brain during the workday, creating a slight difference between the two settings. In this case, I suggest maintaining your scheduled internet usage strategy right after the workday ends. To simplify, when scheduling internet use after work hours, you might allow time-limited communication during your offline block, e.g., texting friends to arrange a dinner, as well as time-limited information retrieval, e.g., searching for a restaurant location on your phone. However, outside of these practical exceptions, when in an offline block, set your phone aside, ignore the texts, and avoid using the internet. Just like at work, if the internet plays a significant role in your evening entertainment, that's fine. Schedule several long online blocks. The issue here isn't to avoid or even reduce the total time you spend on distracting behaviors, but instead, you'll provide yourself with many opportunities to resist switching between distractions with the least amount of boredom during the evening. One aspect that makes this strategy particularly difficult in non-work hours is when you are forced to wait, e.g., standing in line at a store. In such situations, if you're in an offline block, simply accept the temporary boredom and fight it by reflecting on a few work-related thoughts. Waiting and being bored is a novel experience in modern life, but from a focus training standpoint, it's incredibly valuable. In summary, to succeed in deep work, you must influence your brain to be comfortable resisting distracting stimuli. This doesn't mean you need to eliminate distracting behaviors. Instead, you must not allow them to hijack your attention. The simple strategy proposed here is to schedule online blocks in such a way that they help you reclaim control over your attention. Work like Teddy Roosevelt. If you were a student at Harvard University in 1876 to 1877, you would have known the first-year student with tousled hair, sideburns like a ram's horns, lively and confident, named Theodore Roosevelt. If you became friends with this young man, you would quickly notice a paradox. On one hand, it seems like everything could capture his interest. His attention was spread across a range of wonderful pursuits, as one classmate described it. A list that biographer Edmund Morris noted included boxing, wrestling, weightlifting, dancing, poetry, and a lifelong obsession with naturalism. Roosevelt's landlady on Winthrop Street was not pleased with the fact that the student frequently dissected and collected specimens in the room he rented. Roosevelt's passion for naturalism was so intense that he published his first book, The Summer Birds of the Adirondacks, during the summer of his first year at college. It was well received in the bulletin of the Nuttall Ornithological Club, a publication, needless to say, that took books about birds very seriously, and the book was engaging enough that Morris judged Roosevelt, at this age, to be one of the most knowledgeable young naturalists in America. To make time for this extracurricular passion, Roosevelt minimized the time spent on what he should have focused on most: his academic work at Harvard. Based on Roosevelt's diaries and letters from this period, Morris estimated that the future president spent less than 6 hours per day on academic work. One might expect Roosevelt's grades to be poor. He wasn't the best student in the class, but he certainly wasn't failing. In his first year, he earned excellent marks in 5 out of 7 courses. The explanation for this paradox in Roosevelt's case turned out to be his unique approach to handling assignments. Roosevelt's schedule was organized by a block of 8 hours, from 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Then, he subtracted time for review, lessons, daily exercise, and lunch. The remaining time was dedicated exclusively to studying. As mentioned, this didn't take up many hours, but he made the most of the time he had by doing class assignments with high intensity. He spent very little time sitting at a desk, Morris explains, but he focused so intensely and read so quickly that he often had more rest time while doing schoolwork than most of his classmates. This strategy requires you to apply Roosevelt's intense focus to your own workday. Specifically, identify a key task, a task that requires deep work to complete that is high priority on your list. Then, estimate how much time you typically need for such a task and set yourself a challenging deadline to minimize the time required for it. If possible, make a public commitment to meet that deadline, such as telling the person responsible for project progress when you expect to finish. If that's not feasible, or if the deadline puts your work at risk, encourage yourself by setting a countdown timer on your phone and keeping it in view while you work. At this point, you only have one way to meet the deadline. Work with high-intensity focus. No checking emails, no daydreaming, no scrolling through Facebook, no running to make multiple cups of coffee. Like Roosevelt at Harvard, focus every free neuron of your brain on the task until it is completely defeated by your intense concentration. Start this experiment once a week at most, so your brain can get used to the intensity and still have time to rest. When you feel confident that you can meet deadlines with your focus, increase the frequency of your deep work like Roosevelt. However, don't forget to set a realistic deadline so you can continuously meet deadlines, or at least get close. But to do so, you'll need to focus intently on every detail. The motivation behind this strategy is simple. Deep work demands a level of concentration far beyond the threshold that most knowledge workers feel comfortable with. Roosevelt's method uses pseudo-deadlines to help you systematically increase the level you typically achieve, and in some cases, provides workout activity combined with rest for your brain's attention centers. Another benefit of this approach is that it doesn't lend itself to distractions. How can you be distracted if you're meeting a deadline? Of course, all methods will make you feel bored at some point and really want to find other stimulating activities, but resist. As argued in the previous strategy, the more you fight these urges, the easier it is to master them. After a few months of applying this strategy, your understanding of the meaning of focus will change as you reach the highest intensity of concentration you've ever experienced. And if there is anything that resembles Roosevelt in his youth, you can use your free time to enjoy healthier pleasures in life, such as trying to impress the sharp-minded members of the Nuttall Ornithological Club. Effective reflection. For 2 years, while I worked as an assistant to a senior professor at MIT, my wife and I lived in a small, charming apartment on Pinckney Street, on the historic Beacon Hill. Although I lived in Boston and worked in Cambridge, the two places were fairly close, only 1.5 kilometers apart, on opposite sides of the Charles River. With the intention of maintaining my fitness, even during the long, gloomy winters in New England, I walked to work and back home. Every morning, I walked to campus, crossing the Longfellow Bridge in all kinds of weather. The city was often slow to clear snow from the sidewalks after snowstorms, which would later discourage me. At lunchtime, I would switch things up by running home via a longer route along the Charles River and crossing the Massachusetts Avenue Bridge. After lunch and a quick shower at home, I would usually take the subway back across the river to campus. This saved me about 500 meters, and then walk home at the end of the day. In other words, I spent a lot of time walking during this period. It was this very fact that helped me form a habit that I now want you to adopt rigorously in your own deep work practice. Effective reflection. The goal of effective reflection is to dedicate a period of physical focus rather than mental focus, walking, running, driving, showering, and concentrating on a specific intellectual problem. Depending on your profession, this might involve outlining an article, giving a speech, developing a problem, or trying to shape a business strategy. Like mindfulness meditation, you must continually bring your attention back to the problem at hand when distractions arise. I practiced effective reflection during my daily walks across the bridge when living in Boston, and the results of this method directly correlated with my personal progress. For example, I completed chapter drafts for much of my new book and worked through many important technical issues in my academic research while walking. In my view, You should implement this method of effective reflection in your life. You don't have to dedicate time for it every day, but aim to schedule at least 2 to 3 fixed sessions for it each week. Fortunately, organizing time for this strategy isn't difficult, as it uses up periods of time that might otherwise be wasted, like walking the dog or sitting on public transportation during your commute. And if used properly, these moments can actually increase your productivity rather than cutting into your work time. In fact, you might even consider stepping outside for a breath of fresh air if you encounter a tough problem during your workday in order to apply the method of effective reflection. However, I don't recommend this method because of its performance benefits, although they're real. Instead, I'm interested in its ability to improve deep thinking capacity. In my experience, effective reflection is based on 2 key ideas introduced earlier. By forcing you to fight distractions and constantly refocus your attention on the issue at hand, effective reflection helps enhance your resistance to distractions and hones your focus even further. To make effective reflection work. You need to understand that, like any form of meditation, it requires practice to become skilled at it. The first time I tried applying this strategy, in the first few weeks after obtaining my PhD, I realized that my distractibility was beyond repair. I ended up finishing long days of thinking with no tangible results. I had to practice it dozens of times before I began to see real progress. Don't be discouraged, though. You will eventually see similar results. Let me share 2 specific suggestions with you. Suggestion number 1. Be aware of distractions and circular thinking. Since you don't have experience yet, when you begin implementing the strategy of effective reflection, the first rebellious action in your mind will be to come up with unrelated thoughts that seem more interesting. For example, my mind would often divert my attention by starting to draft emails that I knew I needed to write. Objectively, this line of thinking seemed unimportant, but in that moment, it had a distinct, almost overpowering influence. When you notice that your attention is straying from the task at hand, gently bring it back and remind yourself that you can think about this later. In many ways, distractions like this are the obvious enemy you need to defeat in the process of developing the habit of effective reflection. Another dangerous foe is circular thinking. When confronted with a difficult problem, your mind will try to avoid overexerting itself whenever possible. For instance, it will avoid diving deep into the core issue by repeatedly revisiting familiar, known information. When I'm tackling a problem, my mind tends to gather preliminary, simple results and then refresh them repeatedly to avoid exerting the effort required to create the necessary solution-driven outcomes. You need to be on guard against this type of circular thinking, as it can quickly destroy an entire session of effective reflection. When you notice yourself spiraling in this way, shift your attention to the next step. Suggestion number 2. Structure deep thinking. Deep thinking about a problem might seem like an obvious activity, but it's actually not. When faced with an undistracted mind, a challenging problem, and time to think, the next steps can become unexpectedly tangled. In my view, structuring the process of deep thinking yields better results. I recommend starting by considering all the variables relevant to solving the problem and then keeping these variables in mind. For instance, if you're outlining a chapter of a book, the relevant variables could be the key points you want to cover in that chapter. If you're solving a math problem, these variables might be the actual variables, assumptions, or lemmas involved. Once the relevant variables are clear, identify the specific question for the next step that you need to answer using those variables. In the book chapter example, the question might be, how can I effectively open this chapter? And a question related to evidence could be, what mistakes might I make if I don't grasp the meaning of this evidence? With the relevant variables in mind and clear questions for the next steps, you now have a concrete goal for your mind to focus on. Suppose you've answered the question for the next step. The final part of the structured deep thinking process is to consolidate the outcome by reviewing the answer you've established. At this point, you can move to a deeper level of thought by restarting the process. This involves reviewing and keeping the variables in mind, identifying and addressing the next steps questions, and consolidating the results, much like a high-intensity workout for your concentration skills. This will help you get the most out of your reflection sessions and accelerate your ability to think deeply. Memorizing a deck of cards. In just 5 minutes, Daniel Kiliff can memorize any of the following: a shuffled deck of cards, a string of 100 random digits, or 115 abstract images. He set a record for the latter in Australia. It's no surprise then that Kiliff recently won a silver medal at the Australian Memory Championships. Based on his achievements, the surprising thing is that he had to train to develop that mental ability. Kiliff shared with me, "I wasn't born with an exceptional memory. Indeed, during high school, he considered himself forgetful and disorganized. He also struggled with his studies and was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. It wasn't until a chance encounter with Tansal Ali, one of Australia's most successful memory competition champions, that Kiliff started seriously training his memory. By the time he graduated from university, he had earned his first national medal. His transition into a world-class mental athlete happened fairly quickly, but it's not without precedent. In 2006, American science writer Joshua Foer won the U.S. Memory Championship after just 1 year of intense training, a journey he documented in his best-selling 2011 book Moonwalking with Einstein. But what's particularly impressive about Kiliff's story is the academic success he achieved during this period of intensive memory training. As a student with ADHD who once struggled with learning, he graduated with honors from one of Australia's most demanding universities. Kiliff was soon accepted into a PhD program at one of Australia's top universities, where he is now being mentored by a renowned philosopher. This successful transformation stems from the research of Henry Roediger, who runs the Memory Lab at Washington University in St. Louis. In 2014, Roediger and his colleagues sent a team equipped with cognitive test tools to the World Memory Championships in San Diego. They wanted to understand what set these elite memory athletes apart from the rest of us. We found that one of the biggest differences between mental athletes and the rest of us was their level of awareness, Roediger explained in a New York Times article, and yes, that article was written by me. The ability to ask questions is referred to as attention control, and it measures the ability to maintain focus on the relevant information required for a task. In other words, memory training is the ability to improve your focus. Once you've strengthened this ability, you can apply it effectively to any task that requires deep work. Therefore, we can infer that Daniel Kiliff did not become an outstanding student because his memory helped him win awards. Rather, his journey to improve his memory, which happened somewhat by chance, helped him enhance his deep work skills, leading to remarkable progress in his studies. The strategy described here asks you to follow the key aspects of Kiliff's training process to achieve similar improvements in your focus. Specifically, this strategy requires you to learn a standard but impressive skill of most memory athletes: the ability to memorize a shuffled deck of cards. The card memorization technique I'll teach you comes from someone who only knew a little about this challenge, Ron White, who won the U.S. Memory Championship and holds the world record for memorizing playing cards. The first thing White emphasizes is that professional memory athletes never try to memorize by rote, nor do they simply observe information repeatedly and then repeat it in their minds. Although this is common among students overwhelmed by stress, this memorization method leads to misconceptions about how the brain works. We're not programmed to quickly absorb abstract information. However, we are very good at remembering context. Think back to a memorable event in your life, such as the opening session of a conference or meeting an old friend you hadn't seen in years. Try to vividly imagine the context. Most people can recall these events in great detail, even though they weren't consciously trying to remember it at the time. If you systematically recall the unique details of this memory, you'll realize it's filled with countless details. In other words, Your mind can quickly store a lot of detailed information if it's remembered correctly. Ron White's technique for memorizing a deck of cards is based on this concept. To prepare for the task of memorizing a large volume of information, White recommends starting by strengthening in your mind the image of walking through 5 rooms in your house. You enter through the gate, walk into the porch, then go to the first-floor bathroom, step out into the guest bedroom, enter the kitchen, and then descend to the basement. In each room, carefully observe the things you see. Once you can easily recall your walk through this familiar location, pin 10 specific details of each room in your mind. White suggests you should remember large items, since they are easier to recall, like a desk, rather than something small like a pencil. Then, establish a specific order of the objects you see in the room. For example, in the porch, you might see the doormat by the entrance, followed by shoes on the floor near the mat, and then a sofa above the shoes. Now you've remembered 50 details, and you can add 2 more from the backyard to complete 52 details corresponding to the number of cards in a deck. Practice this visualization exercise by walking through the rooms and observing the items in each room in the specific order. You'll notice that this image-based memory technique, based on familiar locations and objects, is far easier to recall than rote memorization you did back in school. The second step in preparing to memorize a deck of cards is to associate memorable people or objects with each card. To make this process easier, try to maintain some logical connection between the card and the corresponding visual image. White gives an example of linking Donald Trump with the ace of diamonds, as the diamond symbol represents wealth. Practice these associations until you can pull out a random card from the deck and immediately recall the associated image. Using memorable images and connections will simplify the task of forming these links. The 2 steps described above are foundational. You only need to do them once, and then you can use them multiple times when memorizing different decks of cards. Once you've completed these steps, you'll be ready for the main event, memorizing the order of the 52 shuffled cards as quickly as possible. The method is simple. Start your mental walk through the house. As you encounter each object, look at the next card in the shuffled deck and imagine the corresponding person or object doing something near that object. For example, if the first object is the doormat and the first card is the ace of diamonds, you might imagine Donald Trump standing on the doormat, cleaning the mud off his expensive loafers. Carefully walk through the rooms, linking the appropriate mental images with the objects in the correct order. After going through the rooms once, you might want to walk through them again a few times to solidify the images in your mind. Once you've done this, you're ready to hand the deck of cards to a friend and amaze them by reading the deck in order without peeking. Of course, to do this, you need to mentally go through the route again, connecting each person or object with the corresponding card as you encounter it. If you practice this technique, you'll discover that, like many memory athletes before you, you'll eventually be able to memorize an entire deck of cards in just a few minutes. Of course, more important than impressing your friends is that these exercises help you focus. Going through the steps described forces you to repeatedly focus on a clear goal. Just like weightlifting helps build muscles, memory training will enhance your overall ability to focus, allowing you to think deeply more easily. However, it should be noted that memorizing cards is not particularly special. Any structured thinking process that requires intense focus can have the same effect, whether it's studying the Talmud, as Adam Marlin explains in the introduction to Rule Number 2, practicing effective reflection, or trying to listen to and identify a piece of guitar music, a hobby of mine in the past. In other words, if you don't like memorizing cards, feel free to choose another activity with the same cognitive demands. The key to this strategy is not the specific details, but the motivating idea that the ability to focus is proportional to your commitment to practice. Rule number 3, escape from social media. In 2013, author and digital social media consultant Baratunde Thurston conducted an experiment. He decided to disconnect from the online world for 25 days. No Facebook, no Twitter, no Foursquare, a service that had awarded him Mayor of the Year in 2011, and no email. He needed a break. Thurston was described by his friends as the most connected guy in the world. He had participated in over 59,000 conversations on Gmail and posted 1,500 updates on his Facebook account in the year before his experiment. He explained, "I felt exhausted, burned out, depleted, broken." We learned about Thurston's experiment through an article on the cover of Fast Company magazine, with the provocative title, #Unplug. According to the article, Thurston didn't take long to adjust to life without being connected. He said, "By the end of the first weekend, I was more at ease with the quiet rhythm of life. I felt less stressed not having to keep up with the news. I realized I was still living without being tied to the internet." Thurston talked to strangers. He enjoyed food without posting it on Instagram. He bought a bicycle. Turns out, biking is much easier when you're not trying to check Twitter while riding. Thurston lamented, "The joy was short-lived." But he had to run startups and promote his book, so after 25 days, he reluctantly returned to his connected life. Thurston's experiment summarized 2 key points about our current relationship with social media tools like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, as well as entertainment sites like Business Insider and BuzzFeed, online distractions that I will collectively refer to as network tools in the subsequent sections. The first point is that we are increasingly aware that these tools waste our time and reduce our ability to focus. This is no longer a controversial reality. We can all feel it. It is a real problem for many, and it becomes especially serious if we want to improve our ability to do deep work. For example, in the previous rule, I described several strategies that can help you sharpen your focus. These efforts will become incredibly difficult if, like Thurston before his experiment, you allow your life to drift outside of any training and immerse yourself in the distracting haze of apps and browsers. Due to limited willpower, these tools become more appealing and capture your attention, making it harder for you to focus on what matters. Therefore, in order to master the art of deep work, you must first take control of your time and attention before these many enemies lurking in every direction steal it away from you. However, before we begin fighting against these distractions, we need to understand our battlefield more clearly. This brings me to the second important point from Baratunde Thurston's story: the helplessness of knowledge workers when discussing network tools and attention. Overwhelmed by the demands of using these tools, Thurston felt that the only option was, temporarily, completely disconnecting from the internet. The period of disengagement from the internet was his only alternative to the distractions caused by social media and entertainment information, which are increasingly widespread in our cultural conversations. Note that the internet sabbatical is not the same as the internet Sabbath mentioned in rule number 2. An internet Sabbath requires you to regularly disconnect from the internet, usually for one weekend day, while the internet sabbatical describes a longer break from the online world, potentially lasting weeks or even longer. The problem is that these 2 options are so extreme that they are practically useless. Of course, the idea of completely abandoning the internet is a fallacy and unlikely for most people, unless you're a journalist writing about distractions. No one actually wants to do what Baratunde Thurston did. This very reality justifies the suggestion for a more balanced alternative. We must accept that these tools are not inherently bad. Some of them are even crucial to your success and happiness, but we must also accept that the threshold for the time and attention required to access a website, excluding personal data, should be more stringent. Therefore, most people should use fewer such tools. In other words, I'm not advising you to completely abandon the internet like Thurston did for 25 days in 2013, but I do recommend you stay away from the hyper-connected, distraction-filled state that led him to take such drastic action in the first place. There is always a key position where, if you are interested in cultivating a deep work habit, you will need to work hard to achieve it. To find this central position when choosing network tools, The first step we need to take is to understand the default decision-making process of most internet users. In the fall of 2013, I fully understood this process thanks to an article explaining why I never use Facebook. Although the article was merely explanatory and not accusatory, it sparked many reactions from readers who responded by justifying their use of the service. Here are a few justifications. Asterisk, I love Facebook mainly because it's entertaining. I see my friends there, posting funny pictures and making quick comments. Asterisk, when I first joined, I didn't know why. I joined a fictional short story forum just out of curiosity. Once I was there, I could improve my writing skills and meet some good people. Asterisk, I use Facebook because so many of my high school friends are also on it. These responses, representing a large number of replies I received on this topic, really impressed me. They belong to such a small group of people that it's surprising. For example, clearly, the first commenter in the list is comfortable using Facebook, but I can also assume that this person doesn't lack other forms of entertainment before using this social network. I also bet that this user has plenty of other hobbies, even if the service were suddenly interrupted. Facebook is just an optional entertainment addition, which is arguably quite trivial, to a plethora of existing entertainment options. Another commenter pointed out the reason for making friends on a creative forum. I have no doubt about the existence of these friends, but we can argue that these friendships are rather shallow, based on the fact that they exchange brief messages through the internet. Shallow friendships like these are not problematic, but they likely cannot become central to this user's social life. It's similar to saying that the commenter reconnected with high school friends. It's an enjoyable pastime, but rarely at the heart of their sense of social connection or happiness. To clarify, I am not attempting to deny the benefits they bring. They are neither illusory nor mistaken. However, I want to emphasize that these are only very small and somewhat random benefits. In contrast, if you instead suggested someone make a case for using the World Wide Web or email in a more general way, the discussions would become more specific and engaging. In response to this comment, you might argue that value is value. If you can find even a small benefit to using a service like Facebook, why not use it? I call this thinking the any benefit will do mindset, because it justifies the use of a network tool by finding any conceivable benefit. More specifically, the any benefit will do approach to tool selection. You can justify using a network tool if you identify any potential benefit from using it or anything you might miss out on by not using it. Of course, the problem with this approach is that it overlooks the negative aspects of tools. These services are designed to be addictive, stealing time and attention from activities that directly support professional and personal goals, such as deep work. Ultimately, if you use these tools too much, you'll reach a state of overload, where hyperconnectivity disrupts your life in ways that have harmed Baratunde Thurston and millions like him. This is where we confront the true absurdity of the any benefit will do mindset. Network tools can be harmful. If you don't carefully weigh the pros and cons, but instead use any potential trivial benefit as an excuse to overuse a tool, you will inadvertently cripple your chances of success in intellectual labor. Objectively, this conclusion is not surprising. In an age where network tools dominate, we've become comfortable with the any benefit will do mindset. But if we observe and carefully consider this mindset in the broader context of skilled labor, it suddenly seems like a poor way to select tools. In other words, when you set aside the revolutionary justifications surrounding everything on the internet, the sense that you're fully committing to the revolution, or that you're a fool for resisting technological change, as summarized in Part 1, you soon realize that network tools are nothing special. They are tools, no different than a blacksmith's hammer or an artist's brush, used by craftsmen to serve their work, and sometimes just for entertainment. Throughout history, craftsmen have often complicated and questioned the new tools they encounter, wondering whether they should accept them. Thus, it is understandable that intellectual workers behave similarly toward the internet. In fact, workers in manual labor, who are increasingly exposed to the digital world, haven't changed this reality. To understand the careful method of tool selection, we should start by talking to people who make their living using tools, not digital ones, and rely on their complex relationship with these tools to succeed. Fortunately, I found a lean, tall guy who majored in English but later became a successful farmer named Forrest Pritchard. Forrest Pritchard runs Smith Meadows, a family farm about an hour's drive west of Washington, D.C., one of many farms in the valleys of the Blue Ridge Mountains. As I understand it, shortly after taking over the land from his parents, Pritchard abolished the traditional monoculture and embraced the novel concept of grass-fed meat. The farm bypasses wholesale. You won't find Smith Meadows beef at Whole Foods and sells directly to consumers at bustling farmers markets in Washington, D.C. and the surrounding subway areas. Thanks to these efforts, the farm is thriving in an industry where small organizations rarely have a chance of success. Whole Foods, a U.S. supermarket chain that specializes in preservative-free, colorant-free, flavorant-free, sweetener-free, and hydrogenated fat-free foods. I first met Pritchard at the local farmers market in Tacoma Park, Maryland, where Smith Meadows is doing well. If you saw Pritchard towering over most of the customers in this suburban area with his faded shirt, you'd immediately picture a confident manual laborer at ease with his work. I introduced myself because farming is a skill that depends on managing tools well, and I wanted to learn how a manual worker in a non-digital field approaches this crucial task. Not long after, during our conversation about this subject, he said, "Harvesting hay is a prime example. It's something I can share the basics with you without requiring any background in economics." He explained that when he took over Smith Meadows, the farm was making its own hay to feed livestock during the winter months when animals can't graze on pasture. You have to harvest hay with a tool called a hay baler, a device attached to a tractor that compacts the hay into bales. If you raise livestock on the East Coast, there's a good reason to own and operate a hay baler. Your animals need hay. But why buy food when the land around you is full of good grass? Therefore, if a farmer applied the any benefit will do mentality of an intellectual worker, he would definitely buy the hay baler. But as Pritchard explained, if the farmer actually applied that oversimplified way of thinking, I'd wager they'd soon have to put up a for sale sign on their land. Instead, Pritchard, like any manual worker, went through a more complex thought process when evaluating tools. After applying this process to the hay baler, Pritchard quickly sold it. Now, Smith Meadows buys hay. This is why. Pritchard said, "Let's start by figuring out the cost of harvesting hay. First, there's the actual fuel cost, repair costs, and the barn needed to store the hay bales. You also have to pay taxes. However, these directly measurable costs weren't the main factor in his decision. Instead, the opportunity cost was what mattered." He continued, "If I spent the whole summer harvesting hay, I wouldn't be able to do anything else. For example, now I use that time to raise more meat chickens. They create positive cash flow because I can sell them. Also, I can use their manure to fertilize the soil. Moreover, there was a wise secondary consideration when evaluating the value of purchased hay. As Pritchard explained, when I buy hay, I have the time to sell animals for cash, and I also get manure, meaning I don't have to spend money buying fertilizer to enrich the soil. My land also won't suffer erosion from heavy machinery working on it all summer long." When making the final decision about the hay baler, Pritchard ignored the direct costs, which could be seen as wasteful, and instead focused on the long-term factors for his land. For the reasons mentioned, Pritchard concluded that purchasing hay would make his land more fertile. He summed up, "The fertility of the land is my starting point. With this calculation, the hay baler had to go." Note the complexity in Pritchard's tool selection decision. This complexity highlights an important reality: the notion that identifying just one benefit is enough to justify investing time, money, and attention into a tool is quite absurd to someone like him in the business world. Of course, the hay baler also had many benefits. Every tool at the farm supply store has its advantages. But of course, it also had its drawbacks. Pritchard hoped this decision would be effective. He started with a clear foundation, in his case, fertile land being key to his success. And from this foundation, he made his final decision on whether to use a specific tool. In my view, if you're an intellectual worker, especially one interested in cultivating a habit of deep work, you should choose tools like manual laborers do, such as farmers. Here is my generalization of this evaluation strategy. I call this the manual worker method of tool selection, emphasizing that, ultimately, the purpose of tools is to support larger career goals. The manual laborer's method in tool selection. Identify the core factors that determine success and happiness in your work and personal life. Only use a tool when its positive impact on these factors far outweighs its negative effects. Keep in mind that the manual laborer's method of tool selection is the opposite of the whatever works method. The whatever works method presents any potential positive influence to justify using a tool, while the manual laborer's method requires that these positive influences affect the core factors of what you consider important and must outweigh the negative effects. While the manual laborer's method rejects the oversimplification of the whatever works approach, it does not ignore the benefits that draw people toward network tools or make any claims about technology being good or bad. It simply requires you to evaluate any specific network tools with the same criteria, considering how tools and other traits have been evaluated in the history of manual labor. Here, I'll provide 3 strategies that follow this rule to help you feel more comfortable abandoning the whatever works mindset and, instead, applying a more cautious manual laborer philosophy when choosing tools for your time and attention. This guide is important because the manual laborer's method is not an instant solution. Identifying the most important issues in your life and then attempting to assess the impact of different tools on these factors cannot be presented as a simple formula. This task requires practice and experimentation. The following strategies will provide practical guidance by forcing you to reconsider your network tools from different angles. When combined, they will help you foster a more refined relationship with your tools, thereby giving you greater control over your time and attention while using the remaining ideas from Part 2 to reach success. Apply the law of essential few to your internet habits. Malcolm Gladwell doesn't use Twitter. In an interview in 2013, he explained, "Who says fans want to connect with me on Twitter?" Then, he joked, "I know many people want me to stop appearing." Michael Lewis, another best-selling author who also doesn't use the service, explained on the Wire forum, "I don't tweet and I don't use Twitter. I can't even guide you on how to read or find a Twitter notification." And as mentioned in Part 1, George Packer, the award-winning journalist from The New Yorker, also avoids using the service and, recently, he even found it unnecessary to own a smartphone. These 3 authors don't think Twitter is useless. They quickly accept that other authors find it useful. In fact, Packer admitted in a response article to David Carr, the late media critic from the New York Times, who supported Twitter, that, "And now, after nearly a year, has Twitter turned my head into dirt? No, each passing moment, I get to enjoy more than I ever imagined. Instead of spending half an hour online looking for information, I know the news of the day and how people are reacting to it while waiting for my coffee at Starbucks." However, at the same time, Gladwell, Lewis, and Packer don't see any service that provides them enough benefits to outweigh its limitations in their specific circumstances. For example, Lewis, who is concerned that spending more time online will drain his energy and limit his ability to research or write great stories, notes, "It's amazing how people overuse the internet. There are many forms of communication in life that don't make me richer, they just make me poorer." As for Packer, he is worried about distractions and believes Twitter is the crack of media addicts. He even went as far as describing Carr's passion for the service as the scariest future portrait I have read in the new decade. We don't need to argue about whether these authors' decisions to stay away from Twitter and similar services are right or wrong, as their book sales and awards speak for themselves. Instead, we can use their decisions as a clear example of the manual laborer's method in selecting action tools, in an era when so many intellectuals, especially those in creative fields, remain stuck in the whatever works mindset. Finding a more advanced method to classify services like these is a breath of fresh air. But the scarcity of these examples reminds us that progressive and confident evaluations of this kind of tool are not easy to find. Recall the complexity of the thought process, discussed in the previous section, that Forrest Pritchard had to carefully consider before making the decision on the hay baler. For many intellectuals and the many tools in their lives, these decisions are no less complex. Therefore, the goal of this strategy is to provide a way to reduce the complexity of thinking about which tools are truly important for you. The first step of this strategy is to identify the key goals in both your work and personal life. For example, if you are married, your personal goal may be related to raising your children well and establishing order in the household. In your work, the goal will depend on your profession. For example, as a professor, I always pursue two important goals. One is to become an effective teacher, a positive mentor to students, and the other is to be an effective researcher. While your goals may differ, it is important that this list includes only what is most relevant and important to you. If you set a goal like $1 million in sales revenue, or publish about 6 papers a year, it would be too specific compared to the goals we're talking about here. You should set goals for both your work and your personal life. Once you've identified these goals, add 2 or 3 key activities that will help you accomplish them. These activities should be specific enough to help you clearly visualize how to achieve them. On the other hand, they should be general enough so that they are not bound to a specific outcome within a time frame. For example, do better research is too vague. What does doing better research mean? While finish the report on radio programs using subgenre analysis for the upcoming conference is too specific, that's a one-time outcome. A more suitable activity in this case would be regularly read and understand key findings in my field. The next step in this strategy is to examine the network tools you are using. For each tool, carefully consider the key activities you've identified and ask yourself whether the tool's use has a significant positive impact, a significant negative impact, or little impact on your success in performing these activities regularly. Now, make an important decision. Use this tool if you believe it has significant positive impacts and that these impacts outweigh the negative ones. To illustrate this strategy in practice, let's consider the following case study. For the purpose of this example, let's assume that if asked, Michael Lewis would set the following goals and corresponding activities for his work as a writer. Career goal: write interesting and profound stories that can change the way people perceive the world. Key activities that support this goal: patience and focus in research. Writing carefully and purposefully. Now, imagine that Lewis would use this goal to decide whether to use Twitter. Our strategy requires him to research the impact of Twitter on the key activities supporting the goal he has listed. There is no evidence to suggest that Twitter would help Lewis perform these two activities well. I assume that deep research will require Lewis to spend weeks or months finding a few sources. He is a master of journalistic skills, able to synthesize a story from multiple sources. Of course, to write well, a writer must focus and avoid distractions. In both cases, at best, Twitter has minimal impact, and at worst, it will have a negative effect depending on Lewis's sensitivity to the addictive nature of the service. Therefore, Lewis should not use Twitter. At this point, you might argue that our limited example focuses on a single, narrow goal, dismissing areas where a service like Twitter could have its best contributions. Specifically, for authors, Twitter often serves as a tool to build connections with readers, leading to higher sales. However, for an author like Michael Lewis, marketing may not be a criterion for measuring success when evaluating what's important in his career. This is because his reputation can ensure he will get widespread attention on major media channels if his book is truly great. Therefore, he focuses more on writing the best possible book rather than trying to increase sales through ineffective means. In other words, the question is not whether Twitter provides any benefits for Lewis. It's whether Twitter has a significant and positive impact on the most important activities in his career. What about a lesser-known author? In this case, book promotion might play a more essential role in their goals. But when forced to define the 2 or 3 most important activities supporting this goal, the shallow relationships that Twitter fosters are not likely to make the list. This is a simple calculation. Suppose our author tweets 10 personal posts a day, 5 days a week, each time they connect with a new potential reader. Now, imagine that 50% of those connected will become loyal fans who are sure to buy the author's next book. Over the 2 years it takes to write the book, their efforts would generate 2,000 orders, a modest number in a market where sales need to double or triple every week to be considered a bestseller. Again, the question is not whether Twitter provides some benefits, but whether it provides enough to justify the time and attention, 2 resources especially valuable to an author, spent on it. We've looked at this approach in the context of work. Let's now apply it to personal goals. Specifically, let's apply this approach to one of the most widely used tools in today's culture: Facebook. When justifying the use of Facebook or similar social networks, most people cite its importance for their social lives. With this in mind, let's apply our strategy to see whether Facebook still has a positive impact on this aspect of our personal goals. To do so, again, let's assume a goal and the supporting activities. Personal goal: maintain close and valuable friendships with a key group of people. Key activities that support this goal: 1. Regularly spend time connecting with the people most important to me, e.g., chatting, dining out, or group activities. 2. Be fully committed to the people who matter most to me, e.g., willing to sacrifice to improve their lives. Not everyone will have goals or supporting activities exactly like this, but hopefully, you understand that these goals work for many people. Now, step back and apply the selective logic of the strategy to Facebook in the context of this personal goal. Of course, this service may bring some benefits to your social life. It allows you to reconnect with people you haven't seen in a while, maintain casual contact with acquaintances you don't talk to regularly, easily follow important events in others' lives, e.g., whether they've gotten married, what their baby looks like, and help you access communities or groups online that align with your interests. These are real, undeniable benefits that Facebook has brought us, but none of these benefits have a significant positive impact on the 2 key activities we listed, both of which are offline and require high levels of focus. Therefore, our strategy would conclude something perhaps surprising but clear. Of course, Facebook brings some benefits to your social life, but none of these are important enough to justify the time and attention you must invest in them. This type of analysis justifies my absence from Facebook. I have never been a member, and I'm sure I've missed many small benefits of the kind of social networking described above, but this does not affect my pursuit of a rich and rewarding social life in any significant way. To clarify, I don't believe everyone should stop using Facebook. Instead, I simply draw this conclusion in this specific case study, which is representative. However, I believe there are reasonable situations that would lead to the opposite conclusion. For example, consider a college freshman. For this student, establishing new relationships may be more important than maintaining existing ones. Therefore, the activities this student identifies to support their social development goal could include things like attending as many events and socializing with as many people as possible. If this is a primary activity, and you are a student, a tool like Facebook would have a positive impact and should be used. Another example would be a military officer stationed overseas. For this soldier, staying in regular, casual contact with friends and family back home is a valid priority and can be best supported through social networks. Through these examples, we see a clear point. This strategy, if applied as described, will lead many people who are currently using tools like Facebook or Twitter to abandon them, but not all. On this point, you might complain about our dogmatism in allowing only a few activities to dominate your decisions about tools. For instance, as we mentioned earlier, Facebook brings many benefits to your social life. Why should someone give it up just because it doesn't support the activities we consider most important? However, the key thing to understand here is that the decision to drastically minimize these priorities isn't dogmatic. Instead, it is driven by an idea that repeatedly appears in various fields, from customer profit, social equity, to preventing software failures. The Pareto principle. In many cases, 80% of the defined results come from 20% of the possible causes. This idea exists in many forms and is known by different names, including the 80-20th rule, Pareto principle, or the principle of scattered factors. For example, 80% of a company's profits come from 20% of customers. 80% of a nation's wealth is held by the top 20% of the wealthiest citizens, or 80% of software failures come from 20% of the specific bugs identified. This phenomenon is reinforced by formal mathematical foundations. You often expect the 80-20th split when describing the allocation of productivity versus impact, a distribution that commonly appears when measuring quantities in the real world. But this rule is most useful when applied intuitively as a reminder that, in many cases, results are not evenly distributed. Next, let's assume that this rule will help you maintain your key goals in life. As noted, we can perform many different activities to achieve our goals. However, the principle of the vital few reminds us that roughly 20% of the most important activities among these will bring about the greatest benefits. Let's say you can identify some 10 to 15 distinct activities that could provide benefits for each of your goals. This rule tells us that the top 2 to 3 activities on the list, the ones this strategy asks you to focus on, will make the greatest difference in whether you achieve that goal or not. However, even when accepting this outcome, you might still argue that you shouldn't neglect the remaining 80% of activities that could yield some benefits. It's true that these less important activities don't contribute as much to the success rate of the goal as the top 2 to 3, but they might still bring some benefit, so why not keep them? As long as you don't neglect the more important activities, there's no harm in holding on to a few less significant ones. However, this argument overlooks the key point that all activities, regardless of their importance, consume the same limited pool of time and attention. Therefore, if you spend time and energy on activities with a smaller impact, it means you're taking away time from more impactful activities. This is a zero-sum game. And because the time you spend on higher-impact activities yields far greater results than the time spent on less impactful ones, the more you focus on smaller-impact activities, the lower your total benefits will be. Business people are well aware of this rule. This is why it's not uncommon for a company to drop unprofitable customers. If 80% of their profits come from 20% of customers, they will achieve greater revenue by shifting their energy from low-potential customers to better serving the few high-value ones. Each hour spent on high-potential customers will generate more revenue than each hour spent on low-value customers. This applies equally to your career and personal goals. By taking time away from activities with less impact, like looking for old friends on Facebook, and reinvesting that time into activities with greater impact, like inviting a close friend to lunch, you will achieve your goals more easily. 1. Will the past 30 days have been significantly more effective if I continued using this service? 2. Do people care that I am not using this service? If the answer to both questions is no, stop using the service permanently. If the answer is yes, go back to using the service. If your answers are conditional or unclear, whether or not you return to using the service is up to you, but I recommend you abandon it. You can always come back whenever you like. This strategy works particularly well with social media because among the various online tools that can consume your time and attention, these services, if used excessively, can destroy your ability to engage in deeper work. They provide continuously surprising personalized information, making them addictive and seriously damaging your efforts to organize and maintain focus. Given these dangers, you would hope that more intellectual workers would entirely stay away from these tools, especially computer programmers and authors who rely heavily on focus to succeed in their careers. However, the stealthy harm caused by social media lies in the fact that companies profit from your attention by executing highly refined brainwashing marketing strategies. They've convinced society that if you don't use their product, you might miss out on something. The fear of missing out is clearly analogous to Nicodemus' fear that a large amount of his stuff in his closet might be useful one day, which is why I suggest a strategy that parallels his packing party. By staying away from these services for a month, you can replace the fear of missing out the events, conversations, shared cultural experiences with a certain amount of reality. For most people, this reality will confirm something that only becomes apparent after freeing yourself from the marketing messages surrounding these tools. They don't really matter to your life. I ask you not to announce your 30-day experiment because, for some people, part of the illusion that binds them to social media is the thought that others want to hear what they have to say and might be disappointed if they suddenly stop commenting. I'm trying to be optimistic in my wording, but this underlying feeling is very common and needs to be addressed. For example, when I write this, the average number of followers for each Twitter user is 208. Knowing that over 200 people voluntarily listen to what you have to say, you can easily believe that your activities on these services are very important. As someone who makes a living by selling ideas to others, I can tell you this is an incredibly addictive feeling. But here's the reality about audiences in the age of social media. Before these services existed, building an audience beyond your friends and family was a difficult and competitive task. For example, in the early 2000s, anyone could start a blog, but in order to even get a small amount of traffic each month, you had to post valuable content to attract attention. I know this quite well. My first blog was started in the fall of 2003. It was cleverly called Inspiring Moniker. I used it to explore life as a 21-year-old college student. I have to admit that for a long time, no one read it. I mean, literally no one. A decade later, when I patiently built an audience for my blog Study Hacks, it grew to hundreds of thousands of readers each month, and I realized that attracting people's attention online is incredibly hard work. But that's a thing of the past now. I admit that one of the factors that fueled the rapid growth of social media was its ability to shorten the link between producing real value, which is hard, and the positive reward of people paying attention to you. However, this has replaced the exchange of endless capitalism with an exchange of shallow collective capitalism. I'll pay attention to what you say if you pay attention to what I say, regardless of the value it holds. For example, blogs, magazines, or TV shows that promote a Facebook post or a Twitter feed generally won't attract much of an audience. But when these social media conventions are applied to the same content, the attention comes in the form of likes and comments. The unspoken agreement that drives this behavior is that to get attention, mostly unremarkable attention, from your friends and followers, you must return the favor by giving them attention, also unremarkable. You like my latest status update, and I'll like yours. This creates a fake sense of importance without much effort on either side. By quitting these services without announcing it, you can test the reality of your status as a content producer. For most people and most services, the news might go unnoticed. No one but your closest friends and family will see that you've logged off. I find it oddly uncomfortable to talk about this. Is there no other way around it? But it must be addressed because the need to assert one's own importance is the primary reason people continue to spend their time and attention thoughtlessly. Of course, for some people, this 30-day experiment will be extremely difficult and cause issues. If you're a college student or make a living through these online tools, this experiment will disrupt your life and will be noticed. But for most people, I suspect the practical outcome of this experiment, if not a total overhaul of your internet habits, will be a more grounded perspective on the role of social media in your daily life. These services do not have to be the lifeblood of our connected world, as the advertising hype would have you believe. They are just products developed by private companies, heavily invested in, marketed carefully, with the ultimate goal of capturing and selling personal attention and data to advertisers. They can be enjoyable, but in the grand scheme of your life and goals, they will create unnecessary distractions that threaten your ability to focus deeply. Or social media tools could be the core issue in your life. You won't know until you experience life without them. Don't use the internet for entertainment. Arnold Bennett was a British author born near the end of the 19th century, a time of turmoil in his home country's economy. The Industrial Revolution had been stirring for decades, and it had received enough surplus capital from the empire's resources to create a new class, the white-collar working class. Now, you could get a job, spend a few hours a week in the office, and in return, earn a steady salary sufficient to support a family. This lifestyle is very familiar today, but for Bennett and his contemporaries, it was new and somewhat stressful in many ways. Bennett's main concern was that members of this new class lacked opportunities to live a fully realized life. In 1910, Bennett wrote in his classic book How to Live on 24 Hours a Day. Take, for example, a man working in an office in London who has to work from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., excluding the 50-minute commute each way. He notes that this person has just over 16 hours remaining outside of work. For Bennett, this time is vast, but most people in this situation fail to recognize its true potential. He adds, "The great mistake of my typical office worker is that, although he doesn't really like the work, he just sees it as a means to get through the day. He persists in considering the time from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. as the day, and the time before and after work is secondary." This attitude Bennett condemns as utterly absurd and unhealthy. What is the alternative to this situation? Bennett suggests that the typical office worker should view the remaining 16 hours outside of work as the day within the day and explains. In these 16 hours of free time, he is not earning money. He is not concerned with financial matters, and he is still fine with his income. Therefore, he should use this time like an aristocrat to improve himself, a task which, according to Bennett, is primarily related to reading classic literature and poetry. Bennett wrote about these issues over a century ago. You could argue that, in the decades of upheaval that followed and the subsequent global rise of the middle class, our thinking about leisure time has gradually changed. But that is not the case. If anything, with the rise of the internet and its increasingly less intellectually driven economy, on average, a 40-hour workweek employee, especially someone from the tech-savvy millennial generation like me, has seen the quality of their leisure time decline, primarily engaging in mindless clicking on the least engaging digital entertainment channels. Had Bennett been alive today, he might have been disheartened by the lack of progress in this human development era. It should be clear that I'm not concerned with the ethical foundation behind Bennett's suggestions. His vision of elevating the middle class's consciousness and thinking through reading poetry and great books may feel outdated and old-fashioned. But the logical foundation of that suggestion that you should and can use your free time purposefully outside of work remains effective to this day, especially in relation to the goal of this rule: to reduce the impact of online tools on our ability to do deep work. Specifically, in the strategies we've discussed regarding this rule, we haven't spent much time on a particular type of online tool directly related to the battle for focus: entertainment websites designed to grab and hold your attention as long as possible. At the time of writing this, some of the most popular websites include Huffington Post, BuzzFeed, Business Insider, and Reddit. This list is sure to grow continuously, but they all share the characteristic of using carefully crafted headlines and easy-to-digest content, often honed to maximize user attention. When you approach an article on any of these sites, the links to other pages on the side or at the bottom of each page will let you click to one more page, and then another. Every psychological trick is used, from lists of popular or trending headlines to eye-catching images, all designed to keep you engaged. For example, some of the most popular articles on BuzzFeed right now are 17 words that mean something totally different when spelled backwards and 33 dogs winning at everything. These websites are particularly harmful after the workday ends when your free time might lead you to get lost in them. Whether you're in line, waiting for a TV show to start, or about to finish a meal, these sites are sure to keep you entertained. However, as I argued in rule number 2, this behavior is dangerous because it diminishes your ability to resist distractions, making it more difficult to focus deeply later when you actually want to work. Worse, because you don't actively engage with these tools, you can't simply remove them from your life by quitting. They're always there, just a click away. Fortunately, Arnold Bennett identified the solution to this problem hundreds of years ago. Think more during your leisure time. In other words, this strategy suggests that when it comes to relaxation, don't automatically default to mindlessly watching anything that grabs your attention. Instead, think ahead about how you want to use your day within the day. The addictive websites mentioned above will still be there. If you don't set a specific task to accomplish within a certain amount of time, they will always be an attractive option. But if you fill your free time with something of higher quality, they will no longer be able to capture your attention. Therefore, it's important to plan in advance what you'll do in the evenings and on weekends. Established hobbies are the best choice for these times, as they provide concrete actions with specific goals to fill your time. Reading books each night, in Bennett style, will allow you to gradually work through your stack of favorite books, of course. This is just as good an option as exercising or maintaining a relationship, meeting someone in person. For example, every year I schedule time to read a lot of books. Whether as a professor, an author, or a father, on average, I usually read 3 to 5 books at the same time. I manage to do this because one of my scheduled leisure activities after my children fall asleep is to read an interesting book. As a result, my smartphone and computer, along with other distracting agents, are often left aside after I finish my workday until the next morning. You might worry that adding such schedules to your relaxation time would defeat the purpose of leisure, which many people believe requires complete liberation from plans or obligations. Wouldn't a scheduled evening like this leave you exhausted, not relaxed, and ready for the next day's work? Bennett anticipated this concern. He argued that people worry about this because they misunderstand the energizing force for the human mind. What? You say that giving full energy to those 16 hours would decrease the value of the 8 official hours? Not at all. On the contrary, it will definitely increase the value of those 8 hours. One key point that the typical office worker in my example needs to grasp is that the intellect is capable of performing a difficult task continuously. It doesn't tire like arms or legs. All it wants is change, not rest, except during sleep. In my experience, this analysis is spot on. If you keep your mind busy with something throughout your waking hours, you'll finish your day feeling more complete and start the next day more refreshed, rather than indulging in hours of aimless web surfing and mindless distractions. In summary, if you don't want entertainment websites to drain your time and attention, focus on activities that benefit your brain. Not only will this help you resist distractions and improve your focus, but it may also fulfill Arnold Bennett's ambitious goal of living, rather than merely existing.